Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the Litmus Fall Reading Group. This is, I think, the fourth or the fifth episode that we're recording, and we're kind of starting to find our feet now. It's been a lot of fun. We've shared three episodes so far, and yeah. This week we are discussing To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. And as usual, we have Tara in the room. Hi, Tara.
Hi.
And we have Pakeezah.
Hello.
And Kavita.
Hi.
And then our guest this time is Nassime. So welcome, Nassime. Thanks for coming.
Hi.
The book begins with a scene where James, Mrs. Ramsey's son, is cutting things out of a magazine. And Mrs. Ramsey promises him that, or she says that hopefully they will go to the lighthouse the next day. And then Mr. Ramsey, her husband, immediately says that that cannot happen. And James feels like this anger. And so immediately we're kind of in the scene where like this sort of tussle between mother and husband and child. Maybe we can just start there. What did you make of that opening scene? What did you think?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
I love this opening scene because because it's the perfect example of kind of it sort of introduces you to Woolf's language in a way and to everything it can do. So it's almost like a kind of muscle flexing right there. I mean, the first word of the first chapter is yes. The first word of the second chapter is no, and the first word of the third chapter is perhaps. Not only that, but like you kind of go in and out of people's heads. So it's not that she's the first person to kind of drag us into a character's head, but she kind of drags us in and then pulls us out and puts us in somebody else's head and takes us out. So you have that kind of fluidity right there that's happening. And then I just love the kind of how would I put it? Like the kind of parody of the Oedipus complex of James wants to just like murder his father for not wanting to take them. I thought like that's another kind, because it's such like a domestic common kind of scene, and then underneath it you can feel this kind of violence like just right underneath the scene of such a peaceful nature.
As I was reading that interaction, speaking of James and his relationship with his father, I was thinking they're not that different. Like they're both kind of pulling on this woman, both yeah. So I found that interesting.
Yeah, and it's not just James who has the vision. Well, James has the vision of cutting his father with, a knife or a poke or whatever. But then you also hear that the father is lean as a knife, and that this feeling emerges in the hearts of all of his children, that absolutely all of them feel this way because of what he is like. His very body sort of cuts them.
So it's hard not to hate him, but I kind of, what I find moving is that Virginia Woolf doesn't seem to hate him, like every here and there, there's like at the end when Lily Briscoe's he's showing his boots to Lily Briscoe. Do you remember that scene? And she describes him as a figure of infinite pathos. I don't know. It's kind of an interesting. It's an interesting deconstruction of masculinity that is both really harsh, but has this kind of empathy to it.
I mean, I didn't find him sympathetic at all.
Yeah.
Not even that scene that you were talking about with the boots. I mean, I felt like he was being ridiculed. But yeah, I thought he was quite maybe even a caricature, because he was so awful. He didn't even seem to have any redeeming features.
Yeah, and yet Lily Briscoe finds him filled with pathos, right? And describes him as, even in the moment of the boots, she says that he still has charm. She uses the word charm.
I read that differently, and I read it similarly to the way that Mrs. Ramsey throughout is constantly trying to convince herself. Like she's always wavering between deep contempt for him and admiration, but that admiration just seems to me to be her trying to, actually it's about herself, maybe we're jumping now to Mrs. Ramsey, but it's like she's constantly trying to justify her life and her existence and the fact that she's devoted herself to this man. So every time she kind of says anything sympathetic about him or, you know, admires him, I feel like it's just her saying, no, I haven't like made a mess of my life to devote it to this man. It's the right.
I feel like there is, I have to say I agree though that Virginia Woolf does seem to have a sympathy towards Mr. Ramsey, which seems strange given the character that he is. And Mr. Ramsey is based on her father, you know, we hear. And I wonder whether this is like the writer grappling with a really difficult relationship that she had and then trying to, you know, how we try to find like some love within that contempt in order to survive. So one part which I really liked, which is a kind of parallel to Lily Briscoe in the booth scene, is when I think it's James, or is it Cam? Let me just check. It's near the end of the novel. It's James. And he says again that he wanted to kill his father. But then he says it's a really nice scene. He says, it was not him, that old man reading, whom he wanted to kill, but it was a thing that descended on him without his knowing it, perhaps. That fierce, sudden, black-winged harpy with its talons and its beak, all cold and hard, that struck and struck at you. And he could feel the beak on his bare legs where it had struck when he was a child, and then made off. And there he was again, an old man, very sad, reading his book. And it feels at this point that there's some, I mean, to imagine like this fierceness or this like a rage and sullenness of this man as being something that descends upon him and perhaps connected to his sadness is something that redeems him, I think, in Virginia Woolf's eyes.
Well, I just feel like to kind of see Mrs. Ramsey and conflate Mrs. Ramsey with the children, to sort of basically say, oh, the children want to kill him. Mrs. Ramsey is just kind of like deep down kind of just has contempt for him. We would lose that really one of the real great subtleties of the text, which is to show that that generational change, you know, between Mrs. Ramsey on the one hand, who like is such an interesting character in her relationship, right, to men, because she says, she's like, she has all of that sex under her protection. She's kind of an older generation, you know, so she so she infantilizes them. And she kind of is not woke enough for her own daughters, you know, who kind of like look up to her and, you know, think that she's silly and think that her life choices, this is like right at the beginning, and they dream of a better life, a more interesting life than Mrs. Ramsey's, versus the kids like James, or, you know, who just want to kill him. And even the daughters who really, really have contempt for him. I think the daughters don't care about him at all. So it's really striking that Lily Briscoe at the end like describes him as having charm and infinite pathos. And I think it's meaningful because of her painting, right? Her painting is supposed to bring male and female together, you know, the kind of the two elements. It's like weaving together those things that are disparate in the same way that, you know, that's what Mrs. Ramsey is said to do, to weave. She's always knitting, you know, she's the great connector, the person who weaves together the different people in the room.
I think it's quite interesting that we've kind of zoomed in on Mr. Ramsey. I guess he's almost like a caricature of himself. But in terms of that polarity and you know, the contradiction that he embodies, and I do think that he is portrayed as sort of a tyrannical figure, but also like sympathetic. I think there is truly love that Mrs. Ramsey does feel for him and Cam, and even James. By the end, he's able to kind of separate something out. He's able to separate his hatred away from like the humanity of his father as well. And I guess like that's one of the things that Woolf does so beautifully, is how she's able to show the way in which people carry these contradictions, and in one moment you feel one way about them, and in the other moment you're completely, you know, you're caught completely in a different feeling. So yeah, I think that it's not, Mr. Ramsey is not unique in that depiction. I think most of the characters, Mrs. Ramsey also displays like tyrannical qualities, right? Although in a very different, with a very different approach, and it manifests in a different way. But she is also kind of abuses her power in certain senses, and people feel that pressure.
You were saying, Nassime, about the scene with Lily Briscoe and the pathos, but what was that was overshadowed for me by Lily Briscoe constantly talking about his obsessive need for sympathy, how he's waiting for her, expecting her to say something. And at one point she says he's like a lion that devours, and his like she feels that what Mrs. Ramsey felt, like amplified far more.
Yeah, in fact, Lily,
but she feels guilty too, and she keeps, feeling bad that and that's probably what defines her. It's like she feels constantly torn between, not wanting to do what a woman is supposed to do, but then feeling that she should have done it. So she should have given him that sympathy that Mrs. Ramsey gave him.
To stay with this idea of Mrs. Ramsey's complicity, I myself feel a bit torn about, like, do we blame women for their own oppression in a sense? But at the same, so on the one hand, Mrs. Ramsey feels like this sponge who's just being like, emotionally drained. On the other hand, like you said, she's like, oh, I am the weaver together of this whole thing, which she is, and the supporter, and like I'm Mother Earth, basically. Like everyone, including Lily Briscoe, are standing upon me. Like none of this would exist if it wasn't for Mrs. Ramsey's like constant sacrifice.
I think I would say that Mrs. Ramsey is like way more complicated than that. I think she's so much more than just the matriarch, and especially when we see her at points when she is kind of in solitude, and where her mind goes is like it's nothing like that. It's not, it is, she has her own interiority that is outside the mother, outside the wife. And also she, as much as she kind of holds on to these institutions of marriage and the way things ought to be, she still very much appreciates Lily for her mind. She admires Lily. She thinks she's more attractive for being intelligent. And she constantly throughout the first part of the text is kind of also very dismissive of men and masculinity, and she describes them as sterile and kind of to be pitied, really. So I think she does both, and I think that's what this novel does, and what Woolf is able to do is I feel you can't pin anyone in any kind of a category. So I would feel really hesitant to try and do that.
But I do think that Mrs. Ramsey is like such an exception to these like strict caricatures. You're right, because she's so complex, and her beauty and her kindness, and the way that Ayesha, you were saying, like she's a sponge of everybody else's emotions, and like the centrality of her consciousness in the text just makes her stand out compared to all the rest.
And there is that scene, sorry Ayesha, there is that scene at the end where Lily's kind of contemplating the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, and she goes into a little bit of detail. It's the first that we hear about it, really, of how Mrs. Ramsey does kind of hold her ground and make Mr. Ramsey apologize and reject him at points, and when she's had enough, she doesn't want to speak to him, and he then has to work to win her back round. And so it's not necessarily the case that their relationship was always her placating him. So yeah, I think again, even in her dynamic with Mr. Ramsey, there is more than, I think it's tempting to see her as the epitome of like maternal mothering, the good wife, but I think she is more than that.
I think connected to what you're saying, Pakeezah, I feel like there's this, I know this has come up in earlier discussions as well, But there is a bit of an illusion of power throughout. So even in this, idea that she can, she has power over Mr. Ramsay, and it's something that's there throughout the novel with, other men as well. This constant idea that she kind of feels like she has power over these men, and the whole references to empire and colonialism also tie into that, because there's a couple of references of these are men who have are colonizers. They've colonized the world, and so these men are so powerful. This is part of her complicity, and yet I have power over these men of some form. But I do think that we can question that power. I don't know what the rest of you think, if that's something that the novel is alluding to, or if that's something that we are bringing to it. But it's not real power. She doesn't actually have power in the world, for example, but even how much power does she have in that relationship as well?
I mean, I think that Woolf is definitely asking us to kind of question that. I don't think we're projecting it. And the reason I say that is because of that scene with Charles Stanley. So when she goes to help this poor woman, and Charles Stanley is kind of fantasizing about her, and it's really funny. It ends with her looking at the poster for a circus. She's saying that kind of masculinity is like a circus, right? It's a performance. But there's this moment when she's coming down the stairs and she's standing in front of the portrait of Queen Victoria. And right in that moment, that's when Charles Stanley is suddenly fantasizes about seeing her with violets and cyclamens in her hair. And I feel like that scene is basically saying she's standing in front of the portrait of Queen Victoria. So he's actually in love with empire. He's not really in love, he's really subjected to the power of empire, not really the power of Mrs. Ramsay. And then she kind of walks by it. So I feel like her standing in front of the portrait is really encouraging us to wonder who actually has real power in this novel,
But at the same time, okay, maybe it's an illusion of power, the same section where you said she has the whole of the other sex under her protection. Yeah. That is an illusion. But then she says, no woman could fail to feel or to find agreeable something trustful, childlike, reverential. She brings this out in men. And Charles Tansey is desperate to hold her bag or pay for a taxi. And in this kind of world, this is just as applicable today, very much so, and in this kind of world where what the power is that a power that we have, the power to make men stop in their tracks and hold our handbags? Is that power or not?
Is it power because it traps her into a certain role? So she has to play a certain role in order to get, this momentary sense of it, which is also quite patronizing as well. But she has to play that role of a woman. So then, that makes you question that poower.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. I don't think that that's real. Personally, I don't think that a guy paying for your taxi or carrying your bag is real power. I think it's just a form of domestication. And we've just been told that that's Mrs. Ramsay believes, it's childlike, it's wonderful, it's this. But her children don't believe that. And suddenly Lily Briscoe doesn't believe that.
And I guess this is the other indication that it is in power, right? Because it doesn't result in solidarity. In fact, it results in her being desperate for Lily and Prue and everyone to get married. Because
she calls, the first thing she says about Lily is that Lily doesn't matter and that she's pucker-faced, and but I don't know that I because of the shape of the whole novel, right? The fact that there's a day and a half and then 10 years and then a day and a half, and in those 10 years it's the war, right, which did kind of actually help the cause of women in the UK massively. I think the first only propertied women were allowed to vote, but it was right there during that time. And so in the way that that's reflected in Virginia Woolf's not into the Lighthouse is that's the moment at the end of the war. That's when Lily Briscoe moves into the house. And then the first line of the next chapter is then peace came, right? So Lily Briscoe moves in and then peace comes. And I personally, I always interpret that as saying this previous era, right before the war, was not a place of female empowerment, right, at all. And in fact, Mrs. Ramsey has to die for then a new era to begin, where those who were previously left outside of the house are brought inside of the house, and there can be peace, and women can finally represent, right? They can finally, like the last line is, "I've had my vision." And like there's this, and there's a line that comes up throughout the novel, like several times, which is the voice of Charles Stanley saying, "Women can't paint, women can't write." It comes up like 3 or 4 times. And I feel like that's the real plot, you know, of what's actually happening. Like an older generation is lost, and it's really sad. And then there's a new kind of era that begins where women like Lily Briscoe finally have a place in that society, and there can be a new kind of representation and a new kind of writing that can begin.
But Lily Briscoe really admires Mrs. Ramsey's attention to what she sees as a certain kind of truth, right? That is, Lily Briscoe has had her vision by the end of the thing, but what Mrs. Ramsey represents for her, and we shouldn't forget that for Mrs. Ramsey and for the novel, what Lily Briscoe represents is that vision, and that vision has something to do with what we're repeatedly told are her Chinese eyes, right? And I think that's interesting. But what Lily says about what Lily thinks about Mrs. Ramsey is she was glad to rest in silence, uncommunicative, to rest in the extreme obscurity of human relationships. Who knows what we are, what we feel? Who knows, even at the moment of intimacy, this is knowledge. Aren't things spoiled then, Mrs. Ramsey may have asked. It seemed to have happened so often, this silence by her side, by saying them. Aren't we more expressive thus, right? That is, Mrs. Ramsey represents a certain kind of lack of interest in knowing. And I think this is maybe partly why Lily Briscoe is able to feel sympathy for her husband, who is interested in his own very narrow idea of the truth, right? Whose accusation against Mrs. Ramsey's way of speaking that he thinks the children have inherited is that she exaggerates, right? Mrs. Ramsey may not be interested in power in a clear way. Mrs. Ramsey's idea of relationships has a claim to a very different kind of truth that maybe the text also endorses in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think Lily is trying to bring both. Lily disturbs the binary, you know. Like Lily there's certain things about Mr. Ramsey that she likes, and certain things about Mrs. Ramsey, and like that complicated relationship that she has, which is, you know, she rejects those life choices, but she also says I owe it all to her, and she feels like I want the hedge, the house, the children. Like she feels the real lure of that life. Like it does have a lure for some of us, you know. Some of us did want to have that life at some point in our lives, at least, you know, like at least when I was younger. I mean, I kind of thought Mrs. Ramsey was like an ideal, you know. Like I didn't think Lily Briscoe is the real hero. Like and it kind of goes back to what Ayesha was saying about reading this at different points in your own journey, like as a woman, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about this as I was reading it this time. The first time I read it, I had no interest in or sympathy for Mrs. Ramsey. I was so bored. But this time, I thought, oh, the way in which the domestic anxieties intrude on what Pakeezah was talking about earlier, which is this sort of much more complex interiority. I had so much sympathy for that this time round.
But I also wanted to bring up other power structures in the novel, and I think that gender probably ends up getting centralized, but I was interested in class, and also I guess we've touched on it, age and youth. So we were talking, Nassime, you were talking about Charles Tansley, and I feel like he's actually quite a complex character. And on one hand, he's atrocious, and on the other hand, I felt like I don't know, not exactly had compassion for him, and it's because of his class background. And I could see that he is an outsider because of where he's come from. And he's come into this world as someone who's, you know, self-made. His grandfather was a fisherman, his dad was a chemist, and he's got this explosive anger in him as well. And he, at one point, I think uses the word gunpowder or something, you know, but he has got this scorn deep down for these people, because he's somebody who has not come and can't take it for granted. And I felt like this is one of the ways in which, I really didn't like Mrs. Ramsey. I think there's lots of things I didn't like about her, but it's this thing about being nice, and everything should always be nice. And, like he threatens that. And of course, because he's feeling so insecure, and he feels so insecure because of his class and coming as an outsider, and, he's not one of them who takes all this for granted, he draws on his supremacy as a man. So, his maleness gets amplified for him because of, his insecurity and sense of inferiority. But then I found that the fact that actually Lily and Mrs. Ramsey, I really didn't find them likable, in the fact that they have no understanding of this and no sense of it, because they don't understand this about him, because they're so comfortable in their privileged location. So, and the other thing at the same time was the fact that they have their insecurities, like Mrs. Ramsey, for example. When she sees Charles, she feels insecure because of her age. And I think maybe Lily does as well. So, they have that insecurity that they're bringing, and they're talking about his youth. No, actually, it's who is the character who Lily might be having a relationship with?
Banks.
Mr. Banks. So he actually says that, Charles, maybe all his politics, and he's young, and maybe he's intimidated as well by his youth. So I guess it all complicates it, but I thought he was a more complex character.
I mean, I would definitely agree. I think that there's definitely a strong case that Virginia Woolf was not as interested in class as she was in gender. But I do think that she was interested in class, because there are passages that kind of address that. And in particular, we might kind of feel that it's clumsy now, but like the character of Mrs. McNabb, who's literally described as the slave class, and like as this poor old cleaning woman. And then during the war, when everyone is gone, the only thing that can see in the house, and like there's this repetition of leering, glancing, looking, watching, like it's the only people that can watch when everybody's at war, gone, or grown old, is certain heirs in the house. And I don't know if that stands in for God or like for the spiritual realm. Like I don't know what those heirs necessarily represent. But and then Mrs. McNabb, and like Mrs. McNabb is like this really kind of almost like this sprightly character, like supernatural character. She's 90 years old, but she's like incredibly limber, and she's like rocking herself and jumping over the banisters and sliding under the beds, and like with her, it's almost like a Walt Disney scene from Cinderella. Like she's like this sort of cartoon character. And I don't know, I mean, there's definitely, it raises the question, like is Woolf kind of celebrating or paying her respects to that class, that other class that is kind of not really in the novel otherwise? Or is she dehumanizing it by kind of fetishizing it as this sort of magical kind of figure? And interestingly, in contrast, she doesn't at all do that with Charles Tansley, who I agree is also marked by his different class. But I feel like it's hard to find sympathy for him, even despite that, because he's so aggressive to the other characters, and he's so misogynistic.
Yeah, so I didn't have sympathy for. The text doesn't have sympathy for him, but I felt sympathy. Mm-hmm. But for the servants are very, very, very marginalized in the main part of the novel. They just it's just basically a name, or this servant, or this Swiss girl, or and they're getting things done. So they're completely getting the kind of the structure of this whole like edifice of this home, but they are invisibilized and marginalized. But then I think that effort to kind of give a voice, like you said, actually just betrays Woolf's limitations, because I think that when you try to create or give voice to a working class character, that character is not three-dimensional. She's just working. She's a working body. And I also felt that she's got this kind of nostalgia for how it was, which I think is always something you know, that the elites would always think that everything is, you know, when it's in that status quo, that is, you know, that is a positive thing, and as if working class characters only exist as part of that, and when that is not there, they will, you know, like actually maybe they could be celebrating that, you know, the masters have gone and now we're free, or, but you could never really imagine it in that way. It's as if they only exist as complete people when they're part of this oppressive structure.
That's kind of interesting, because I found that it's interesting you would say like they're marginalized, and they are, right? Like they're definitely not all the central characters are rich, and they're not the only people in the world depicted, but yet they're centralized. But structurally, and Virginia Woolf is really into structure, you know, because of the 2 days, 10 years, 2 days things, and like the shape of her sentences and stuff. If you open the book right at the middle, you find Mrs. McNab. Like she's at a structural and formal level, at the center of this novel is an old lady cleaning a house. You know, and if you slice it down the middle, that's what you get. So it's like this weird, yeah, I agree, like this kind of effort to centralize and to ask a question and to say like, what about these other characters? And where do they stand in this transformation? Because of course, that middle part of the novel is the war.
So there is some attempt at engagement, like you're saying, with the Mrs. McNab section. At the same time, I think what Kavita was saying was about Mrs. McNab herself, her nostalgic look at, oh my God, the house used to be so wonderful and vibrant. And now, you know, so this presumption that they would have this kind of nostalgic gaze at what was going on, I found a bit suspect as well. And then her engagement with Charles Tansley and his class is also there. And just in the fact that, you know, it keeps coming up, and in his like loathing of it, but also like desire to be of it, you know, there was something about that felt very real and precise. And then also Lily at some point, I think she says about Charles Tansley, like, it's impossible to dislike anyone really if you look close enough. And so Virginia Woolf does have this remarkable quality of even these sort of unlikable characters, like someone who says to Lily, like, women can't write or paint. She's still thinking about why he says that and how he said that, not because he really thinks it, but he has to think it or he wants to think it. So there's always this kind of interrogation of different kind of psychological layers of the characters. And yeah, no doubt there are limitations, but I think there is a real attempt, just as Lily attempts with her painting to look as closely as she can. I think there is an attempt to look.
I think for me, in terms of the depictions of class and the working class, I think there's there's different economies going on here, where you've got Mrs. McNab, which I actually thought was probably the one real point where I felt like Woolf was very patronizing and actually did a quite a terrible job of depicting a character where she's quite grotesque, isn't she? She's like barely human in her depiction. And you know, the stereotypes around what she cares about and how she spends her time, she is a total caricature with no interiority. She has no interiority in a text that is centered on the interiority of the characters. Whereas with Tansley, I feel like he is depicted in a much more complex way, and that's perhaps because he might be poor and he might be from a working class background, but he's managed to work his way out of that. And there's this whole economy around intellect, which he can place himself there, regardless of his poverty. And in a way, he owns his poverty, doesn't he? And he uses it to kind of torment the upper class, the other characters in the text. So I think there's something about the fact that he is male also, but the fact that he is an intellectual, which makes him more acceptable than Mrs. McNab, who is purely there to labor, right? To carry out the needs of other people. Yeah, and her depiction is so simplistic. I felt that was Woolf maybe trying but doing a really bad job.
So I think it's like, maybe clumsy, but it's not she tried really hard, you know. Like I feel like there's a real effort here of saying, you know, visions of joy there must have been at the wash tub with her children at the public house. So she's this kind of privileged woman imagining the life of a poor woman like Mrs. McNabb and saying like there must be something nice in her life, maybe from her children, maybe at the pub, like she had some good times, you know. So she's like really trying, which, as irritating as it is I feel like better than erasure, you know, which is what was common in the writing of the time.
To be honest, I think erasure is better. I think, I mean, you basically can't imagine that people live lives that are not in relation to you. So, and yeah, through that perspective. One of the things I do wonder about Charles Tansley, though, I'm not sure if we are bringing the sympathy to his character, and is it actually there in the book? And is it Pakeezah that said this? I wonder if there is some truth in that maybe there is something that the writer is bringing to, you know, judge him, which is again reflecting her class location, which is, you know, a kind of this crass person who is, you know, whose masculinity is just so, you know, violent and aggressive, who, I mean, in some ways he's not different from Mr. Ramsay, but Mr. Ramsay is able to be that in a more sophisticated way than Charles Tansley, you know, be that man, and he's able to get what he wants out of the world. He's actually a worse character, but Charles Tansley is, you know, depicted in a way where I feel like there are some readers, especially in that context in which it was written, who would be reading Charles Tansley with kind of, you know, sniggers and recognition, because they would know somebody like that, and that person would have been like really awkward and uncomfortable and irritating and dismissed by everybody and kind of ridiculed when they're not there. We still see this now as well. I feel like Mr. Ramsay is a character who can have it all. And this is what like is infuriating about him, because he's able to be very egotistical, but at the same time he's able to have a perfect life where he has a beautiful wife and he has his children, and he, you know, he's able to still have a supposedly ideal life.
He's unhappy.
He's unhappy. I mean, in the end, Mr. Ramsay is revealed to be wretched, right? And Charles Tansley is revealed to be more kind of happy or settled, even if it's said in a slightly cynical way. I also feel like a reader, my guess is that a reader would have more sympathy for Charles Tansley than Mr. Ramsay, just because with Charles Tansley, you understand more the sources of his bad behavior, if you want to call it that, you know. And also just the way he's described his background is referred to, how he's supporting his sister and his father, how hard he's worked, how he'd rather be in his room, how insecure he feels. I think actually he's a much more sympathetic character than Mr. Ramsay. I mean, Mr. Ramsay also, there is like an explanation is attempted for his bad behavior, if you want to call it that, and that's just a kind of like a darkness or a wedge or some kind of like something that just leaves him devastated. Like in the end, Mr. Ramsay turns to stone, whereas Charles Tansley manages to live.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that of all the readers, right, who are going to read this in 1927, some of them would have been like Charles Tansley, you know, some of them would have been people who did not come from the upper class, but still went to Oxford and now are desperately like have this complicated relationship with that class. And I think like those readers, by reading this, they're invited almost to kind of think about how much of their misogyny is like how much of their kind of feelings about class intersects with their misogyny, and vice versa. People who are not like Charles Tansley kind of also thinking about how those two things are related, you know, like again and again there's this sense, I don't know if you got this sense too, but that Virginia Woolf is almost saying because of his class insecurity, he's even more misogynistic and violent against women because of the class insecurity that he feels. So almost like if one went away, the other one would be alleviated.
Yeah.
That way?
When you say even more, I think maybe you're saying even more than Mr. Ramsey, and not necessarily, or maybe you mean even more, because
Well,
Mr. Ramsey has an interesting, like, where does Mr. Ramsey's misogyny come from? He's like wants to go from A to Z, but he knows that he'll be stuck at Q, right? And he can't get over the fact that he'll be stuck at Q, and he needs constant comfort and reassurance that, oh, Q is amazing, like it's amazing that you reached
I mean,
Q.
I don't know that Mr. Ramsey has much of an excuse for the way he is, beyond the fact that he's like super privileged, like sees himself as like the leader of an expedition, right? Like he's kind of like this like privileged white man born in a society that places him at the top of the food chain. And so he makes himself miserable or asks constantly for our sympathy and like fills himself with whiskey because he just can't deal with like the privilege of it all. I mean, I don't know where at least with Charles Tansley, like, you know, he's facing real obstacles. But what's, I don't know if Mr. Ramsey really has much of an excuse, which doesn't mean that we're not invited to have sympathy for him.
It's maybe, I mean, to me, it felt like the mother's breast, like he's a child reaching for the mother's breast, right? Like,
I don't think the text is looking for excuses for anybody. I don't think that's the logic on which the text works at all. And I think that's actually one of its flaws also. In terms of class, I wouldn't say that this is particularly groundbreaking for its time. In fact, I would say if we're thinking of it in the line of progress, it takes a step back in terms of class from 19th century novels in both the French and the English traditions. I do think that even, for instance, we talked about Jane Eyre, that novel can imagine an interiority for all sorts of people much better than this one can, I would say. But it is interesting that the person with whom Lily Briscoe imagines that whole fantasy of shedding the codes, that person is Tansley. And so do you remember that moment? Like for me,
when does that happen?
I've been looking for it for some time. Yeah, I think this is it. So they're talking, and this is where we hear about Tansley is thinking about how he's remembering all of this to say to his actual friends, right? About how they all talk so much nonsense. And he says, there in a society where one could say what one liked, he would sarcastically describe staying with the Ramseys and what nonsense they talked. Stuff like that. Then he thinks they were talking about the fishing industry. Why did no one ask him his opinion? What did they know about the fishing industry? Now, what's interesting is that then it turns to Lily Briscoe, and Lily Briscoe knows that he's thinking that somehow. She has this sort of X-ray vision, literal X-ray vision. Lily Briscoe knew all that. Sitting opposite him, could she not see, as in an X-ray photograph, the ribs and thigh bones of the young man's desire to impress himself, lying dark in the midst of his flesh? And there's this disturbing image of the skeleton of his vanity, right? It turns out that it's his vanity that is a kind of skeleton that she can see, and she feels something for it. That thin mist with convention had laid over his burning desire to break into the conversation. But she thought, screwing up her Chinese eyes and remembering how he sneered at women, can't paint, can't write, why should I help him to relieve himself? And then she remembers the code that Mrs. Ramsey lives by, right? There is a code of behavior she knew, whose 7th article it may be, says that on occasions of this sort, it behooves the woman, whatever her own occupation may be, to go to the help of the young man opposite, so that he may expose and relieve the thigh bones, the ribs of his vanity, of his urgent desire to assert himself. As indeed it is their duty, she reflected, in her old maidenly fairness, to help us, suppose the tube were to burst into flames. Then she thought I should certainly expect Mr. Tansley to get me out. But how would it be, she thought, if neither of us did either of these things? So she sat there smiling. I think that's one of the most powerful moments. Yeah, for me.
I love that. And also,
is it really a step back? Like, what would I don't know. I'm not a specialist that time period, but it makes me. Charles Tansley always reminded me of Mr. Collins. You know, like
right.
Prejudice, and I don't know. I feel like with Mr. Collins, there's almost no. It's just so. He's just so ridiculous and awful in every possible way. Like, there's no redeeming. There's no X-ray vision into his like desire to, you know, he doesn't have his real friends, right? He doesn't exist beyond being a sycophant to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and that's like his only being. Whereas here, I feel like Charles Tansley, as much as, you know, there's a disdain for him, that he has more almost kind of
I'm
an idea.
thinking less of Tansley and more of people like Mrs. McNabb, you know, of working class people. And I don't think that novels, no matter what the political position of the author was, like Balzac as a royalist could imagine working class people who had all sorts of thoughts and feelings and motivations independent of the upper classes. And so I don't think it's remarkable for Virginia Woolf to be like trying to do this, because this has been the project, I think, of the novel in a mainstream sense for a long time. I don't know. That was just an aside, though. I'm really impressed with the idea of the skeleton of his vanity, that creepy image that then gets taken up as what she can see, what she is supposed to be able to see, and then according to that old code, be able to see and to help. But what she thinks, oh, why can't we just relieve ourselves of these codes, you know?
Yeah, I actually really enjoyed that section you read out, Tara, also because you read it out from, like, it was a long passage and you kind of walked us through it, and it also showed kind of the beauty of the text, how we're going from one mind to the other and deeper and deeper. I really enjoyed that passage a lot. And how like it starts from one place and then it goes completely in the opposite direction, and then the other, you know, she's thinking something really horrible about him and then something positive about him, and then she kind of like, so it's just interesting the way her thoughts are veering. But yeah, like what if he wasn't the what if he wasn't the one who rescued her on the tube, and she wasn't the one who appeased his ego? Then, like, what would happen then? I like that idea.
I really like how the interiority comes via people. Usually it's through through someone looking at someone else. And so you hear something about what they look like, and then it goes in to the consciousness of the person. And it's always through eyes and exchanges of gazes.
It really feels like kind of like an internal monologue, and it contains like the chaos and the contradictory natures of our internal monologues, but it's done in such a way that we can follow and understand. It's remarkable skill, I think.
I also love how like illogical it is. Like there are moments where so Mrs. Ramsay, for example, in her mind, she's just kind of completely dismissing Charles Tansley as being, you know, really obnoxious. And then she'll balance it out in her mind by saying, but he's got a nice smile, hasn't he? and that somehow creates some balance, and she can feel softer towards him. And that happens in so many different ways, so much throughout the text. And I think it's so true to life, isn't it? The weird kind of inconsistent feeling that you can have for somebody, and how it can just, you know, in the space of 10 seconds go through so many different feelings.
I think this is what I was already saying before. I feel like it's so extreme, the way she goes from one to the other, and it's not just that she likes his smile. It will be like, he's just such an amazing man, he's so admirable, he's so intellectual, he's so important, and it's so extreme that it makes me think that it is her trying to talk herself into or convince herself of this.
But isn't that a part of Mrs. Ramsay's character? She's like continuously being accused of exaggerating, so it could just be that she kind of thinks in these extreme ways as well, and that's just how she kind of expresses herself to herself and to others.
I'd really love to touch upon another aspect of the text, which is the darkness of Mrs. Ramsay. There is something there that is very, very dark and dangerous. And it feels important to go into also kind of thinking in the context of Virginia Woolf's own life. She explores this with Mrs. Dalloway as well. I find it really fascinating, this kind of access. So we're talking about her as this maternal figure, and perhaps someone who doesn't think a lot. But then there's also these plunges into the depths, and her husband is aware of this, just as Virginia Woolf's husband was aware of her own plunges into the depths. And that's something that they're also navigating together. He gets quite upset whenever she goes into that dark place. And part of the reason why she is the way she is, it seems, is to avoid that dark place. The last thing she wants to do is kind of be distracted enough to hear the waves, for example, because they will remind her of I guess, the impermanence of life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in the fact that she has these dark moments, like there's the terror that she feels, the rumbling terror from the noise of the waves. And also that really, I mean, one passage that I've always found kind of difficult to understand, which is, at the end of part 2, when he just wants her to say, I love you, and she won't say it, even though she loves him. Like those things, I think that we can't really separate them from the way that Virginia Woolf kills Mrs. Ramsey, which is in a bracket. Right, like completely, like randomly at where you least expected, in a bracket. And I think they're all connected. The darkness she feels may be connected to the world and the oppressions that she is the product of in many ways, but also her death. And
there's also a secret, don't you think? There's a secret in the text. It's like nobody knows what happened to her. There's a few indications of like something happened to her. It's subtle, but there are indications of like,
I mean, I remember that we're never told, right? We're never actually told how she died. She just dies.
Oh no, sorry. I meant there's a secret to her past.
Oh.
Yeah, like as in something before. There was someone before Mr. Ramsey, for instance. There's also indications of a woman, potentially. Yeah, there's just little hints of something beyond, something in her past.
Or even the way that the war like haunts the novel, right? From the catalog that James is cutting out, it's an army catalog, and it kind of like, or the concept of empire, like it's all there, but it's all kind of in the background and not intruding on the sort of central plot, which of course kind of feels like a device to kind of bring together all these other things. So I'm wondering if it's like that, like it's an allusion to what is lost, what is lost through the war, what is lost in those kind of power dynamics, and what is lost in that world. She's so obsessed with time passing.
Yeah, I mean, I like the word haunting. So there definitely feels to be a haunting, and also it feels to me as if there's an underlying message in this novel that Lily Briscoe, in fact, is able to keep this kind of darkness at bay because of her art, And so I felt like this is almost, I mean, first of all, it's Virginia Woolf's exploration. I get really interested in like the writer and her personal life always. I don't know why, it's a thing. But first of all, it's Virginia Woolf's like exploration of her relationship with her mother. But then I think it's also her relationship with herself and these aspects of herself. So she's divided it, like she's put the darkness into Mrs. Ramsey, and the art, which I think perhaps saved her from her own darkness, into Lily Briscoe. And there's this kind of strange battle going on.
But it didn't save her. She killed herself.
Virginia Woolf, yeah, exactly. It didn't save her. It saved Lily Briscoe.
Yeah, it saves.
But yeah, it didn't save Virginia Woolf. I mean, Virginia Woolf, I feel also there were secrets. There were secrets in her past, and some of them occurred in this very place where she's set to the lighthouse.
But I don't know. I often feel like nervous about doing biographical readings, especially with women, because it's been used as a way to minimize their import in literature quite a lot. The case in point would be Sappho, that people like said her work was so good she couldn't have been a woman, she must have been a goddess. Like it's this idea that like it must be because this happened to her. So I'm nervous about doing that, especially because she killed herself, and like that's a whole thing. But I realized this morning actually that she, her husband had a press, and they were among the first to publish Freud in the UK. So there was obviously an interest also there in kind of like the unconscious, like the repressed, like Freudian kind of, and ideas that might also be there in the novel.
It's also like both Lily and Mrs. Ramsey make indications that they just want to drown, like they want to sink into the water. It's really hard to not think of Virginia Woolf's own life when you see these women being attracted towards the water and seeing it almost as a space of immortality, right?
Mm.
I mean, it is a difficult separation to make. It's very unfortunate. It happens to Sylvia Plath as well. Like, I guess female writers who take their own life, that sometimes becomes central in our readings, or mental health issues or whatever. So
yeah, they almost become part of their own fiction in some ways. Like there's such a kind of a story around it, and yeah, it really kind of blurs the boundary between their created work and their actual life. But I do think it's problematic though to kind of to bring that into the text.
Yeah, I mean, nobody talks about how Julius Caesar was epileptic, you know, like no one cares. It's just everyone's focusing on the conquest of Gaul. And I feel like when it's a woman, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, you know, this happened to her, that happened to her. She, you know.
Really? I mean, people, yeah.
The answer to then also bring it in with male writers rather than to not, because I mean, isn't it important to always think about a text coming from a particular life and a particular period and a particular point of view? And so maybe we should be doing that with books by men as well.
I didn't know.
A different, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Pakeezah. I didn't know about the Julius Caesar thing, but like Dostoevsky was epileptic and people talk about that a lot. Or Henry James, I think his father was epileptic, and how those things, Stephen King is another, like people whose trauma, I guess it's just like a personal interest as well, but people whose personal trauma like weaves into the text and how that informs it and sometimes forms the core of it. I don't know. I see what Kavita's saying about maybe bringing it in with the men as well. Whether it explains. Sorry, Pakeezah, I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say, I think providing context is helpful, but when it becomes like the way in which you sort of judge a text, I think that is less helpful. And I do think that there is more of that almost kind of like mythologizing of the author, that I personally I feel like I come across that more with female writers than with male writers. But in terms of the brackets, and you know, in the post-war sections of the book where she just mentions that Prue has died and that Andrew died and Mrs. Ramsey's dead, I actually thought that was like incredibly powerful, and almost because of the fact that it's such an aside, it becomes so central. Like it really hits you quite hard, and it does almost like alter the atmosphere of the book when you're reading. So it felt like she almost does that on purpose, you know, so you're able to really feel the trauma, if that makes sense.
It's also,
yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
It's also the contrast with the, you know, the first section, and it's like this microscopic detail, like this really solid structure that's created, and you know, such detail, and then it's kind of almost become, you know, shown to be something that's not so meaningful as, you know, it feels when you're reading it, that it can just go you know, in such little words. But what were you going to say, Nassime?
Well, I just I was looking at the brackets, and the brackets, I kind of feel that this book is really about, not really, it's about many things, but one of the things that it's also about is kind of, you know, male literature and her place in that, you know, because of Virgil and Mr. Carmichael and, you know, all these other kind of aspects of the novel. And I noticed that in the brackets, so the first and last things that are bracketed is Mr. Carmichael. The first one is Mr. Carmichael reading Virgil, and the last one is Mr. Carmichael publishing his own poetry. And then Mrs. Ramsey, Prue, and Andrew's deaths are kind of in the middle just of those two things that are kind of bookends. And I can't help but feel that that's sort of saying, you know, while it's sort of drawing our attention to the continuity, you know, of men reading other men, being published about them, writing their own things, going to university. Like there's this that happens, that continues to happen. Meanwhile, these characters die either in childbirth or during war, or for reasons we don't know.
We haven't talked much about the constant references, you know, the literary references and what they mean and what they represent in the text. I mean, Tennyson is used a lot, right? And so much associated with like chivalry and honor in those references. I sort of felt almost in a way, you know, there's the journey to the lighthouse and Cam and James.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Yeah. Totally just forgot his name for a second there. They're almost like they have this pact between them, right? That they will stand up to tyranny, and that being Mr. Ramsay is almost like this new generation, right? And Lily representing a new type of woman and finding place for that. I almost felt like Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay kind of represent the old world, right? Like before the war. And the fact that Mr. Ramsay keeps like spouting Tennyson in this really antisocial kind of way. I just thought there was so much in that, wasn't there?
Yeah, and the allusions to Shakespeare as well,
Yeah.
both as a kind of a symbol. There's that moment where Mr. Ramsay says this rock will outlast Shakespeare, you know, and there's this. so there's an ongoing discourse about men and the books that they read and write.
Oh my God, he's so obnoxious.
So
On that
bad.
boat as well, he's like, they're talking about some fishermen that drowned, and he's like, no, but my suffering is like.
Yeah.
The women frequently make fun, especially of Tennyson. Like he's just been quoting, what is it, the Charge of the Light Brigade, and then the next thing is, but what had happened? Someone had blundered. And this is Mrs. Ramsay thinking, someone had blundered, right? But the blunder results not in 600 men dying in this sort of military heroism, but rather someone has annoyed her husband, right? Someone had blundered. So just the deflation, the repeated deflations of what Nassime and Pakeezah were pointing out as a kind of male literature, it's just, that is really funny throughout the novel.
And yeah, it's clearly Woolf is making fun, and there's also the scene at dinner where I think it's Tansley says, oh, no one reads Scott anymore, and then Mr. Ramsay gets really self-conscious about that, and he like resolves to read Scott after dinner, and he's kind of making a point of how much he's enjoying it. He's like laughing and slapping his thigh and just having the best time being somebody who reads Scott. And Mrs. Ramsay is just casually trying to also read something after dinner, and Mr. Ramsay keeps thinking, oh, you know, she probably doesn't even understand what she's reading. So awful.
She admits that she sometimes doesn't understand it, but it works to the discredit of the work rather than to her. She talks about words which she had held meaningless in her mind for a long time, and they suddenly kind of take on meaning for her in a really petty, sort of pathetic context, you know.
And also how I think almost another way of resisting that is how Mrs. Ramsay has an affinity for or likes better men who are unintelligent, right? Unintelligent, but with who are pleasant. And definitely there's something in that as well, which is almost a resistance from Woolf, I feel, to that superiority that men feel for themselves.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
But I do think that there's a mockery of academia for sure in the, you know, when she describes like his dissertation, Charles Stanley's dissertation being about like, I forget how she formulates it, but it's really funny. Like it's kind of mean.
Someone doing something about someone, or something.
Someone's influence on someone else. Like it's that's his whole dissertation, and so I do think there's a kind of a mockery there, and also, I mean, the fact that Virginia Woolf as a person is erupting into a male-dominated canon. You know, like she's also, so it's not. And those two things are connected because like the guardians of that literary canon are the academics, you know, who kind of decide what gets taught, what doesn't get taught, who gets in, who doesn't get in. And so like I think they connected, right? Gender and a critique of academia and the idea of being a female author.
Well, there's the really funny way that Andrew describes to Lily what his dad does, which is imagine a kitchen table when you're not there. And so every time Lily imagines Mr. Ramsey's work, in her mind is conjured the image of the kitchen table, which I thought was really funny. It's a very funny novel as well. Actually, there were so many moments which really made me laugh. The way that she pokes fun at people. Especially that scene where Mr. Ramsey is like begging Lily for some sympathy, and she's just like, no.
And the way that's described is gorgeous. It's like something about the puddle, like the puddles of his longing around her, and all she does is like draw up her skirt. Something like that. I think we're going to stop there. Thank you so much, guys. It's been a really interesting discussion, and we've gone into domains that I wouldn't have, that I didn't even think of. It almost makes me want to reread certain sections of the book, especially kind of the Mrs. McNabb section, for instance, and the brackets as well. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Thank you to Nassime for joining us. It was a real pleasure, and we hope that you come again. We'd love to have you.
Thank you so much for having me in your group. It's a really great dynamic. I wish that I had more of this, going on in my life.
Well, come again. And thank you to Kavita and Pakeezah and Tara, as always. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Ayesha. I should have said that in the beginning. Lots of love, guys, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you.